Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson. Today's guest is Nick Meacham, the Managing Director at SportsPro Media and the Senior Independent Director at the British Volleyball Federation. Nick has plenty of experience from the business of sport, and in this episode he shares his knowledge on OTT, digital trends, volleyball, cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and much more. In other news, this week we are sponsored by InSport Education and their new online course, Governance of Women's Sport, developing structures that are fit for purpose. When it comes to effective sports governance structures, historically many sports have copied the structures for men's sport and applied them to women's sport. But this doesn't account for the particular challenges and opportunities for women's sport, the nuances, specificity required for the unique platform of women's sport. Now you have the opportunity to learn about governance of women's sport, and with the code Sports Management Podcast 10, you will get 10% off this and all other courses offered by InSport Education. Click the link in the description below and sign up today. Nick Meacham, welcome to Sports Management Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Marcus. Great to be here with you.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. Been a busy old day. Lots of meetings, a lot of them virtual, especially these days, but lots of meetings and conversations going on. I was involved with a Swedish conference this morning, which was fun, the SportPro conference. So good to have sort of two connections with Sweden today in one day, which considering my wife's Swedish is something I'm pretty used to now, but it's quite funny that it's coming on the business side as well.
We are delighted to have you. You're doing several things, but let's start with SportsPro Media, where you are the managing director. So can you talk a little bit about your role there?
Sure. So, SportsPro Media is a organization that has around 35 people in it. It has been around for about 13 years. It's really, in the simplest way, I would define as both a media and conference business. On the media side, we cover the business of sports, everything from digital transformation, marketing, sponsorship, streaming, technology, all across the world. So we're covering all corners, heavily focused on both Western and Asian markets. And we produce about 10 news stories a day on our website, 5+ features a week. So pretty much giving as much breadth of content to the industry as you'll find on a global level. We produce about 400,000 visitors to that website every month, people consuming the content there. We also have a number of podcasts that we run. So there's the SportsPro podcast, there's the Stream Time podcast, which I have been hosting now for a couple of months. And that's, again, around digital and streaming. We also run virtual events. We also run in-person events. And in a typical year, we had, I think, around 9 conferences in 5 different countries, which included Spain, Switzerland, the UK, Singapore, and USA. I always get stuck on one of those countries. So we have about a couple of thousand people that attend those events on a typical year. Through the pandemic, we shifted to virtual, and those numbers went from a couple of thousand to probably north of 10,000, which I can talk a bit more in a bit more detail later on. But sort of that's in a nutshell. We're a pretty medium-sized media business and events business, talking to people who are executives in the industry, producing content to keep people not only up to date what's going on, but really trying to look more forward. Like, what are the new topics, the new trends that you need to keep an eye out for? What are some of the new things that we're seeing across the wider industry about every day?
From the podcast side, I know that Matt Rogan is hosting the SportsPro podcast, and he has been an earlier guest here, so it's great to talk to you here. And to your point, you're doing digital, you're doing events, you're doing print as well. How are these 3 pillars allocated?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how the business is structured, I suppose, we have a pretty even split between our publishing business or our media business and the events business. We have about 10 or so people in our editorial team producing the editorial content. I think it might be even closer to 12 these days. And so that team works in silo, works as a department. to make sure they're covering all the most important news and insights, but also has a year-long schedule of content they want to cover across the industry. And that could be one day, it could be sustainability. The next week, it could be women's sports. The next week, it could be esports. But really trying to go deeper on some of those different sort of topics. Virtually, we've also run, as I said, a host of digital events. I think it was something like 8 or 10,000 unique people consumed that over the last 18 months in about 105 countries. And so we have a dedicated events team that works across our virtual and physical events that we do run. I sort of talked earlier about the sort of subject matter we cover, and that again fits into the events. We have a big focus on OTT and streaming is really a core topic for us. We run 2 dedicated events and kind of 3 or 4 on that specific sector alone. The next one being in the US, and we just had one in London a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, in terms of, we reach about 15,000 people every day across our website, newsletters and podcasts. So a lot of content being produced and a lot of reach to people across the industry. But despite the fact we're based in the UK, where 75% of our audience really is outside of the UK at least. So it is very much an international audience. And a lot of those countries aren't even necessarily English first speaking countries, because we're talking to people in international sports roles where they're based. So we are reaching quite wider than just sort of focusing on markets like the UK or the US.
It's a very interesting fact with the 75% are outside of the UK. I think that speaks to your global reach as well.
It's been a focus for us, but it's also really happened fairly organically. And I think that's just the way we've seen across our industry, this internationalization of the way sports does business. It used to be very siloed by domestic market, but the world's getting smaller now in terms of that connectivity. And also, how do you learn about new ideas and insights if you just focus on your own country? Like take it in Sweden, if you're just working in the Swedish market and you don't look outside of it to find inspiration for new ideas and new technologies and new ways of doing business, it'll be really hard for you to identify those opportunities that can really push you forward. And so that's what the role we're trying to play. And some of that has happened really organically. It's not necessarily a primary focus for us.
You mentioned OTT, and that was what I was thinking that we should focus on mostly because of your knowledge on the subject matter and also your stream time podcast, as you mentioned. Yeah, if you can just generally talk a little bit of OTT in sports and how do you think that this will develop?
Yeah, I mean, we launched and really moved heavily into the OTT sector from a focus point about 4 or 5 years ago, when we started to see all of this momentum, and the analytics were actually showing us all this content that we were producing around this subject matter was just becoming hugely interesting to the industry. And so really for us, the marketplace, even over the last 4 years, has shifted so much, and what we understand and what the opportunity looks like. To give you some examples, I suppose, we've now sort of understood, or we can understand what role OTT plays for a major sports property to what the role OTT plays for a smaller sports property. And OTT sort of sits within term of going direct to consumer. It's not always, but because it depends on if you're going OTT and you're a broadcaster, or you're going OTT yourself with producing, your own platform to produce content that you want people to consume. But for example, if you're a tier 1 sports property, well, going direct to consumer with an OTT platform isn't as much of a priority, because you have such an interest from broadcasters to acquire your content and use it as a way of attracting subscribers and audiences. But for tier 3 or tier 2 or tier 3 sports, OTT platforms become a priority because they don't have the opportunity to be broadcast through traditional channels. And social media is a place to get scale on audience, but it's only in the short form typically that works on those platforms, not the live match. So OTT platforms are becoming more and more important to those secondary tiered sports to have a platform to showcase their sport, at the very least, just to their own fan base. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of sports where they never get the chance to watch their favorite sport that they might be deeply passionate about, because it just doesn't make it onto mainstream media. An example of that might be, I'm just trying to think of a sport off the top of my head. Let's say a sport like squash. Squash is a sport that is actually immensely popular in a lot of countries, but almost never makes it to mainstream TV. They were one of the first to move into the OTT sector, about 10 years ago or so now. and create a dedicated product just for themselves to sell. And they have a fan base that really relishes that opportunity because they can't get access to it anywhere. And if you're a passionate fan, that's where people are being let down in the old way of working, where broadcasters only pick what's going to move the needle for audiences. Like, how do I attract more audiences? Well, football is the number one world's most popular game. So I'm going to buy more football because that's what they want. And that's going to support the masses. OTT allow us to go more niche, but still extract more value from those audiences as well. So squash, as an example, they can charge quite a premium if they want to for the product, because if I'm a squash fan, that's the only place I can go for this. So even though I'm a tier 3 sport, I'm willing to pay way more for that product than I would be if you're giving me a entertainment product or a broadcast proposition that has all sorts of things I don't really have an interest in. So it's just OTT's playing this real role of sort of unlocking or opening the door and opening the opportunity for the secondary and third tier sports to have a platform they can really build their business around.
That's very interesting. So what would be your opinion if we talk about, you mentioned football, it's the biggest sport in the world. Let's talk UK, Premier League. I have read a book by Daniel G. Has been a podcast guest here, also done deal, and he talks about the broadcasting deal and so much money that comes in from broadcasting. So do you think in a large league like the English Premier League, the OTT could have a future, or is it just too difficult to compete with the current broadcasting deals?
Look, with the Premier League as an example, depends on what market. So if you look at the UK, for the Premier League and look at the UK, the numbers are so incredible that there's no way that OTT would be able to come in until you see streaming being completely adopted by the entire consumer and community. It's still having this transition in consumption, which means that you still have people consuming on cable and other platforms. They're not ready to go all in on streaming. But the value on those rights is so high. Most of the people that are buying those rights are actually losing money on those deals, but they're using it as part of the bigger package to try and attract people to their wider offering, the bundle, as we would call it, particularly on the telco side, and Sky's leading the charge there. But a good example of this actually would be with the Bundesliga. So I recently spoke to the CEO of Bundesliga's digital arm, Andreas Hayden, and something we talked about there was, they're extremely innovative. They have a whole digital business with, I think, something like 150 people working there, which they manage all of the production and the technology and the innovation in-house. They don't use any other production partners. And so I asked him, what OTT yourselves? And he said, well, actually, we've already built a platform. We are ready to go. It's just a matter of the economics. So in every market, we do media rights deals. And if ever we get to a point where those deals aren't significantly more valued than the OTT, we'll keep in that market. But as soon as that switches, that calculation drops low enough, we're ready within a couple of weeks to go live. And so they're just ready to go whenever they do need to. They haven't needed to yet. And will that happen in premium markets? Almost certainly not. It's more likely to happen in the more immature markets where they aren't able to extract a lot of value. But in terms of the case of the Premier League, they were very close a few years ago, reportedly, to launch an OTT offering in Singapore. And now Singapore was obviously a very small market, but almost as a test bed for them. Again, it was that borderline issue with rights, and it gave them an opportunity to potentially see what the appetite would be like. They ended up doing a last-minute deal. So they sold the rights to a broadcaster in Singapore, and so it's business as usual. So the prospect of the Premier League creating its own platform or the teams broadcasting their own matches isn't something I think you'll see for a long time, particularly at the values that their rights are right now. I mean, they're extraordinary. One thing I would add, though, there is a great example of this. Actually, I spoke to someone in the Greek Football League, so a much lower tier sport, but in Greece, it's a premium property. Their media rights relationship or arrangement is quite different, and where each of the individual teams is paid a sum by the broadcaster to broadcast their games. If you don't accept it, you do have the capability of sort of going direct yourself and producing an OTT platform. They got offered about 50% of what they believe they should have, and the competitors were offered. It was in the millions. So they decided, look, we're out of principle, as well as out of interest, they decided to go OTT and broadcast all of their games live themselves. And they got through the year. They didn't quite make the amount of money that they were offered. They made the majority of it. But what happened was at the end of that, they were able to basically, I guess, showcase that they have an audience there that's willing to spend to watch their team. And what they ended up doing, they got that deal that they were after last year. They got paid double what they were offered a year later, even if the club struggled that year, because they'd proven that there was a case for that and the broadcaster needed their rights. So it's being used more as a negotiation tool than necessarily going to be the future of broadcasting for these football leagues, at least for the next couple of years. In 5 years' time, it could look a little bit different.
That's an interesting example with Greece there. I've actually lived in Greece for a couple of years, and I know that football and basketball is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously it's a small market, but the passion and the fan base is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And this story, and that I was shared, I could share numbers, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to because I was told in confidence. But they're not massive numbers, but for a club in those markets, they are. And that negotiation, now it's the third time I've heard of a different football property using a similar technique to drive up the revenues from broadcasters and negotiating tactic. And it is working. So it's interesting to see how long that sort of tactic will be successful. But I can imagine as we see the shift in consumer behavior to use more streaming products, that will become more and more part of that conversation every time you get to deal time.
Yeah. Another sport, mixed martial arts. So if we talk about the UFC, they have another setup. They are having a deal with the ESPN to send some of their events. And they also have a pay-per-view, an OTT platform that they are streaming themselves. If this is something that you have seen in other sports, that they are having both broadcasting deal with a network and doing their own OTT thing?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more that we're seeing this happen. Some of it is done exclusively. Some of it's done in a non-exclusive fashion. UFC is a great example. The deal with ESPN is a pretty comprehensive deal. And some rights sit on the platform itself and some do sit with ESPN or ESPN Plus. Pay-per-view is part of that mix. Also, we've seen two interesting deals recently, which are the WWE signed a $1 billion 5-year deal to shut down its OTT platform and shift all of its content into the new NBC streaming platform, Peacock, which is a huge moment because WWE was lauded for the quality of its OTT platform and had spent best part of a decade building this audience up, building this network, all to just shut it down because, well, there's a nice big check waiting for them to do so. PGA Tour did something similar. So PGA Tour were paid by ESPN to shift their PGA Tour Live product into the ESPN Plus product, and they shut down their US proposition again. So that's probably a little bit different, but it's actually where they've decided to shut down what they're doing because the check's too good for them to have that exclusive arrangement. I mean, the obvious examples of that multi-tiered sort of offer is the NBA and the NFL. They've been doing it for decades, where they have it available through their Game Pass and League Pass options, but they're also broadcast in various markets. And that can happen through whether the NFL, for example, is in Europe. You have some games typically broadcast on the local broadcaster, whether it's in the UK or Sweden. There's only 1 or 2 games probably in the week, but everything is available freely on their OTT products that they've created. So they're probably the best examples of that. Some of the other sports have been very apprehensive of making that move for fear of impacting some of their deals. But I think you've seen more fragmentation of rights. So some of the content will sit in their OTT platform. The rest of it will go onto the broadcast platforms, but they'll keep some of them to themselves so they can start learning more about their audiences and kind of get people ready to move over if they ever need to.
If we move on and we talk about the SportsPro, you're also doing a lot of work for women's sport and try to push that part. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, we're certainly making a conscious effort to cover women's sports more closely. You know, we can see from the data that there's some interest in the content. It's not crazy high yet from the editorial side that we produce, But there is so much momentum coming behind women's sports now that we made sure that we're committing time and resource into covering that space. And now, more recently, we're seeing more broadcast deals. We're seeing more sponsors coming on board. Big brands are now investing into the space because they're understanding the value of connecting with these audiences. And also, digital allows the ability to target these audiences more closely than what the traditional linear relationships used to be like, where it was just on mass. So I just think that we are seeing a definitive shift in the way women's sports is being supported commercially by broadcasters and by sponsors in particular. And because of digital and social, you're able to quantify that a lot more. The passion and the support behind women's sports collectively is pretty clear that there's a lot of excitement behind that. And there's a real appetite right across the world, not just from women, but also from fans of those sports who want to see more and more competition. And there's an interesting example where in the UK, I'm not sure how much you know about cricket, but there's a new competition called the 100, which was launched by the cricket governing body. It was basically built as a linear TV first product. So they shortened the game. So there's already 3 different versions of cricket, a 1 day, and a 3 or 4 hour long version. This was shortened again to try and fit within that nice sort of couple of hours of window that all the broadcasters love. But it was targeted towards new fans and it was targeted towards families. And what they really focused on was building a product that was evenly positioning men and women from a content perspective in terms of the amount of exposure they would get. And that has gone down incredibly well, both from a fan base in terms of audiences consuming it. The stadiums have been full right from the beginning. Families are coming in their droves to watch, but also the sponsors are loving that positioning as well. And they've been supporting it right from the day one. I think the numbers are something like they generated £50 million of revenue in the first year. And that's primarily built around sponsorship, not as much on media rights. And they were profitable from year one as well. I think they made something like £10 million in profit for year one. So what it's sort of showing us is that when sports properties start looking and taking the women's sports opportunity more seriously, it is unlocking all sorts of commercial opportunities as well. Whereas historically, up until the last 5 to 10 years, it was always thought that women's sport was a cost point for these organizations to invest in. Actually, if they do take it seriously and commit to it, they're unlocking all sorts of new ways of building fan bases and commercializing their organizations as well. There's all sorts of questions being asked about it, though, in terms of just how women's sports should be managed moving forward to let it grow as well as it should. For example, should it stay in the same federations and organizations that the men's sports are run? Leveraging the expertise and leveraging perhaps the finances. On the other side, they're saying, well, actually, should they go standalone, perhaps attract private money, private equity, and build from scratch themselves and not be burdened by working with the older forms of the game and the older stakeholders that exist? So a lot of interest to see where that does go, because if it does go down this whole idea of going after private equity and going out alone, it'd be really exciting to see, because we are starting to see examples like the 100, other organizations launching new sports properties that have a completely different model in how they work and produce their sport and deliver their sport. And it's working, moving away from those traditional ways that we used to see the sports biz work. So I'm really excited to see what does happen over the next couple of years, particularly in the women's sports space.
Me too. And it's funny that you brought up if there should be different federations. One of the sponsors on this podcast is In Sport Education, and they just dropped a new course that is governing women's sport. And they mean that historically, the government of women's sport have just been a copy-paste from men's sports. Mm-hmm. And that way you're missing out on certain opportunities that you can leverage women's sports. So, it's interesting that you brought that up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important area to look at, particularly if you work or are involved in a governing body like I am with British Volleyball as well, because you do have to look at each, not only the men and women's side of things, but you have to look at the different demographics and how you talk to them. You might have different disciplines, and you do have to react differently to them as well, because it's very easy. You have a lot of sports where they just want to talk to a certain part of that audience, and what happens is they are leaving a lot of people behind. So I think that's a really important thing to be focused on.
I like your segue there into British volleyball. So let's talk about that. You are the Senior Independent Director at British Volleyball Federation.
Yes. So I've been that for a few years now. So for context, the British Volleyball Federation is the federation that connects the home nations in the UK. So that is Volleyball England, Volleyball Scotland, Northern Ireland volleyball, and Welsh volleyball. And their primary focus is around managing the elite sports side of volleyball in the UK. So the home nations are responsible for, say, the development of grassroots and participation, whereas British Volleyball Federation is explicitly responsible for basically the pathways that lead to the Olympics or Paralympics. So within that, we are responsible for beach volleyball, indoor volleyball, and sitting volleyball, and technically snow volleyball, which is a new sport that is starting to develop as well. And so my role at the British Volleyball Federation is to sit on the board to help direct and guide as to what decisions need to be made. A lot of it's still very volunteer based, so there's also a lot of work that needs to be done. For example, we have to submit quite detailed submissions for funding support to the UK Sport, the government funded organisation that manages the funding. And for a while we didn't have any funding, so it's only recently we've been able to secure that, and now our role is to make sure that that money is spent effectively as possible to help drive performance across the different disciplines that we're focused on.
It's nice to see like sports like volleyball and also handball that they, as you said, they try to evolve. Like you have beach volleyball, you have snow volleyball. Does that bring up the interest for the sport generally?
What's good about it, I actually spoke to the Volleyball World, the commercial body of the FIVB, the International Volleyball Federation, about this. And I sort of expected them to say, beach volleyball is seen by many as the more exciting version of the game, particularly for crowds and so forth, and perhaps for TV. So I expected it to be the sport that they said to me was, the discipline that created the most interest. But what they actually said is that indoor is so popular in certain markets, like in Italy, in Sweden it's quite big, but in Italy and in Poland and Russia and other markets, it's so big that actually indoor far outweighs the beach game in terms of its prominence and audience. So it just depends on where you're based. I think in immature markets, so smaller markets like the UK, who the interest levels in volleyball is still fairly immature. Like there's not a lot of interest in it on a day-to-day perspective to watch it. Although the sports are growing at a rapid rate, it's still fairly sort of early stages in its development. Beach is a great game for people to get excited about and engage with. So if I want to introduce someone to the game of volleyball, I will always get them involved with the beach, because indoor is so much more complex, whether even if you're going the most basic rules possible, and it's hard to understand when there's so many people on the court. Where in beach, you get lots more touches and you run around and you own the court and it's a lot more fun. So beach is great for that point of view. It's really easy to teach people the basics of it, to get into it right from the beginning. And it's an exciting sport. I've spoken to many people about the experience of seeing at Rio 2016 and Copacabana Beach, the huge arena on the beach for beach volleyball there. They had it at Horse Guards Parade in London, incredible arena, outdoor arena for the beach volleyball. And it just got people so excited to have that sort of atmosphere. And we're seeing right across the world now more of these beach sort of competitions developing, which the crowds are incredible for those sorts of experiences. So they're both driving audiences, but I do think that the more mature markets have much more of an interest in the indoor game. The immature markets, as beach sort of lives strongest.
Do you have a background as a player in any sport?
So, I grew up in Australia. So, in Australia, and if you know any Australians, they grow up with sport as part of their life and their culture. So, everyone follows sports and almost everyone plays some form of sport. So, I played a lot of sports growing up in my life. Then I got into sports like golf and tennis on the individual side, but then I got into volleyball when I was about 13 years old. I joined a school which was really, really strong, was one of the strongest schools in the country on the volleyball program that it had in place. So I went from doing nothing to living and breathing volleyball for about 4 or 5 years, and played at a decent level at the juniors there. But what I found is once I finished high school, there wasn't really a strong sort of amateur competition for where I lived. And so I would have had to have gone to the city, which is a few hours away, to play matches if I were to continue playing. So I kind of gave up on volleyball then after 5 long years of playing and training and living and breathing the sport. And it was only when I moved over to the UK about 8 or 9 years later that I took up volleyball again. I came over from Australia and I thought, what can I do in winter, which isn't outdoors, to keep myself active and have to deal with all the cold? Because in Australia, we don't have it like that. And I thought, oh, let's try volleyball again and see how we go. And so I got involved. I just joined a social team and then sort of got back into it, then started playing at a pretty decent level across the UK for a number of years, then got into coaching. And as I got older, and then got involved on the board side a few years ago. So that's sort of my journey there. But volleyball came in, took over lots. I played a lot of tennis, cricket, and golf as a younger kid. But yeah, a bit of everything growing up when you live in Australia. You don't have much choice.
I see. As an executive for both SportsPro Media and British Volleyball, how would you define your leadership style?
Well, it's always a tough question, I think, for anyone to answer, to be reflective on themselves. And I'd probably have to ask others to get a real answer of how my style actually is. But the main thing I like to do is always ask lots of questions, check and challenging why things are happening, asking people the questions to make sure that they are thinking through some of the things they're doing, but also try and be supportive to help give guidance wherever possible. I'm big on logic with decision making. So if someone's deciding to do something, I will always ask why. Why do you want to do it that way? And not because I disagree, just want to make sure that the logic of why we're doing it is thought out and is practical and isn't just because someone's got a hunch and they haven't really thought it through. So that's a big thing for me. So therefore, aligning with that is constantly innovating, I would say. So really making sure that we're always looking at what we do and asking, can we make this better? Can we make it so it goes from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10, an 8 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10. And I do think you sometimes hear about people, the balance between having a plan and sticking to that, and also being someone who does innovate when they need to innovate. And I think there's a fine line, but for me, you need to know when to react, and also just as importantly, when not to. And I think on the leadership side, generally, I've always tried, and I still try every day now, to prioritize my own team over anything else. So if any of my management team comes to me for a question, or anyone in the company comes to me to ask something, because I want to make sure that I'm not the one sort of holding them back, and then waiting for anything from me to come through. So I always try and prioritize the team over anything that I've got on sort of my schedule. So I think that answers the question.
Definitely. With regards to education, how important do you think that is in the business of sport? And also, what is your educational background?
Sure. I think in terms of what's important, there's a load of different directions. The main thing I say to anyone is find a way to get a start, because the industry is actually smaller than people realize. There's actually not as many. If you really want to work in sports, and depending on where you live, there's actually not that many opportunities to get started. And so if you do get the chance to get a foot in the door, get your foot in the door. Some people say, maybe find the right opportunity for you, or do some research or study. And look, those things are all valid. But for me, get a start and then try and work it out in conjunction there, because once you get a start, it's sometimes a bit sad, but just the doors will open up to more opportunities pretty quickly and pretty easily. In terms of skills that we're seeing now, people that are analytical, that understand data, are all super skills that everyone is looking for. People that can better, look at intelligence for your business is always important. But as a skill, communication is by far the number one skill you can have. It's something like I remember growing up and all through my both high school and university years, I never wanted to speak publicly. I never wanted to do any presentations. I just hated that experience. Some people love it, some people don't. And then what I realized much later on in life, that if you can talk comfortably in front of people, you can go a long way in lots of different roles. It's just such a soft skill that it is so important. And to my background, I studied business degree. I initially started in a double degree, business majoring in sports management and exercise science. For a couple of years, I realized I really didn't want to sit in a lab doing tests on frogs' legs and all this sort of thing. So I decided I'm going to stick with the business world and shifted my degree into business, majoring in sports and event management. And I did that degree somewhere between part and full-time, whilst working full-time in sports. I worked at a big resort on the Gold Coast in Australia, where I was running events as well as running the sort of the sports resort itself as part of the management team there, and also the health club side. So I got a good taste of things whilst I was studying, which I did find really valuable. So look, there's different ways you can look at it. Some people say, study first and then get into work and focus on your studies. It was a really hard couple of years, but by working at the same time as studying, being able to transfer what I was learning into my day-to-day just changes the way I think you look at things when you're studying. You're turning that theory to practice, which is difficult for people when you study a course for 3 years or so. You rarely get that chance unless you fall into this perfect role that takes advantage of all your skills that you've developed and knowledge you've developed. So that's another thing that I think was beneficial for me anyway.
Yeah, and what you said in the beginning there with the sports business being small, I've actually noticed that because I've 30 plus guests now on this podcast, and they have varied from Sweden, UK, India, US, you name it. And many people either know each other or know about each other. So that speaks a little bit to what you said there.
Yeah, I honestly think the industry is one or two, like 2 degrees of separation. You either know someone who, I always say this to people who ask, they come to me maybe for some advice or some help, and I said, look, I'll either know someone who can help you with that, or I'll know someone who knows someone. And that's pretty consistent once you've been in the industry for a while.
If you look back on your career, has there been any bumps on the road? And if so, how have you overcome them?
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I would say there's been a couple of bumps. The first bump I faced when I moved over to the UK from Australia, I found it incredibly difficult to get a start, not just in sports, but just a job, because people see you as a foreigner coming in. They're not sure how committed you are to working. And I went through, never been through more interviews in my life, and sent my CV out to more people, spoke to more recruiters. And I really struggled through that phase of, I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I couldn't see where that opportunity was going to come. And I had to take a role that was paying me about a third of what I was earning when I was living in Australia. So it took a huge hit, but I got a start finally. And after I got a start, again, I was thinking what I talked about before about getting a start in sports. As soon as I got a start, I got a role, all of a sudden, everyone was interested in me because it was like that sense of validation. Well, someone's hired you, so you must be all right now. And all of a sudden I was getting all sorts of opportunities thrown at me from different places. So the bump in the road is getting sometimes that first job, or if you do, you're out of work trying to find that opportunity. That was a real struggle for me. And I got really lucky, with SportsPro. I was offered the job. I started there, but I had to tell them, like, I've only got 9 months on my visa. Otherwise I get kicked out of the country. And they said, look, come in, we'll see how things go. We've never sponsored anyone, but let's just see what happens. And I did well, and they ended up sponsoring me to keep me in the country. I'm now with the company, so 12 years later. So sometimes you've got to go through a few bumps to find the right opportunity, or let the opportunity find you in those instances. And the other one I'd say, probably from a bump perspective, was the pandemic has obviously been a bump for a lot of people. And for us that was running an events business, that was a huge hurdle. Like the majority of our revenue at the time was by far coming through our events side. And we were fortunate, but we've always known that we're still a fairly small business. And at the time, pre-pandemic, we had about 20 staff in the team. And we worked through, okay, well, what are we going to do here? And we sort of looked at it and identified, well, hey, we've got this audience to our website every month. And actually, we're not really linking the couple of thousand people that come to our events each year in person. 400,000 plus a month aren't getting access to that event. So the prospect of going virtual and creating something where we could start connecting this huge media audience we had to these events all of a sudden just made loads of sense for us. And so what we decided there is like going from a bit of, oh shit, now what are we going to do here, to let's move quickly. And we're going to do something that's not just what everyone's doing. We're going to do it a little bit differently, a little bit more comprehensive. We've got great contacts, but we've got to move really, really fast. And so we launched a new virtual event series that generated, again, thousands of people coming to those events, those virtual events online right from day one. Commercially, our sponsors and partners all supported us. We had something like 85 or 90% of our commercial partners who were supporting our events in person shifted their support to our virtual stuff. And so that's massive when I've heard all sorts of horror stories from events businesses that didn't get that same sort of support. So we were really, I'd say, part lucky and part, we really made a decision to go for it rather than everyone else typically went, okay, we're going into hibernation now. We're going to either let people go, or we're going to go furlough people, or we're going to try and just survive until this next year or so sort of happens. And what we decided to do is the opposite. We sort of went, let's go for it here and see if we can, I guess, really win people over and provide something that people will really value. And that was the best decision we probably made. We had actually probably our best year ever that year, which is pretty crazy considering I haven't heard a single story like that, both for even media or events businesses over that time.
Yeah, I mean, if the pandemic has taught us something from business, it's, the importance of digital. That's you couldn't have survived without it for the last almost 2 years.
Yeah, and actually what was interesting, I think, through that period is now we launched and we were one of the first movers, and the support for that was great. And over the next 12 months, more and more people started to do the similar sort of things. So I would get my calendar with like 4 or 5 different webinars being sent to me on the same time, the same day. And you also saw a bit of fatigue starting to set in because of all this virtual content that was being published. So now, look, we've had to start shifting it, rebalancing again. We brought back in-person events, but had to recalibrate a little bit to go, okay, less is more in some of these situations now. Back then, it was like we want to go more is more and give people more of everything. Now we've had to take a step back and make sure we're a little bit smarter with the content we do, to also make sure that our in-person events are going to be really valuable, because so many people do come to them just for the content.
Yeah. Approaching the end of the interview here, we have talked about your role at SportsPro Media. We have talked about volleyball. We have talked about OTT. Is there something that we haven't mentioned that you feel is important to talk about?
Oh, I mean, look, not particularly, but I would say that in terms of depending what people's interests are, there's a lot of pretty exciting things happening in our industry right now. And I've kind of talked a little bit about some of them, but even in the event I was speaking at this morning, SportsPro Media, that one I talked a lot about digital trends in the industry. And I think there's a lot of exciting things to be following here, particularly around things like the move of sports to go direct to consumer. There's also a lot of different models that are being tested that very few are actually proven, but a lot of excitement around things like what blockchain can bring to the industry. So from a technology perspective, how it's going to help ticketing. We've seen NFTs, I'm not sure how familiar the audience will be. Some people will know it, love it, spend lots of money on it. Some will have no clue what a non-fungible token is. But they're expecting those to be in the sports space to be generating over $2 billion of transactions next year, which is an extraordinary number for a word I'd never heard of before 12 months ago. And cryptocurrencies coming in, and all this sort of innovation technology is just creating such transformation in the industry. So for anyone who's in the space or wants to get into space, you need to keep a big eye on what's happening in the tech space, because they are going to have an impact. And in fact, when I talk to sports, they're all trying to work it out. So if you know the answers, you'll be very handy and helpful if you want to get into the sports industry, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely a topic for a future episode here with NFTs and cryptocurrency in sports, since more and more athletes are getting paid now in crypto.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a real proliferation of that, particularly in the US. And I think I'm still very scared of that as a concept. So it's not for me, but some people have already made a lot of money out of making that move to not only receive funds via cryptocurrency, but also to invest in that space. But also there needs to be a lot of change and a lot of regulation to come in. We've actually, on the flip side of all that, we've seen a lot of cryptocurrency companies throwing a lot of money in sponsorship. But we've seen in markets like India, where the Indian Premier League, the cricket league there, which is one of the biggest leagues in the world, have put a complete ban on cryptocurrency and betting sponsorships from next year until it's more heavily regulated. So lots going on in that space. You need to be going in with eyes wide open, I think, in that space, whether it's investing in cryptocurrencies or just working with anyone in that sector.
For sure. The last question that I ask the guests here is, if you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who would you recommend that I should talk to?
Oh gosh, so many great people that you could try and bring on. I would say, but if you can find someone who can really talk through blockchain and how it can play a practical role in the sports industry, I'd be all ears, that's for sure. So if you find someone who's a specialist in that, I know I'll be tuning into your next podcast if you find someone in that space.
I will definitely look into that and let you know if I found someone.
Good stuff.
Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Sports Management podcast.
Thanks, Marcus. Great to chat with you and really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram @SportsMPodcast.